something's going on over there. Trying to mind my own business. Every once in a while, something, happens to this whole chunk of coal. I've been, living in this old HOA. No, nobody can mind their own business. But I caught my interest. My neighbor, he's over there with his electric grill. Has a brand new roof. Two-car garage. Two-car garage. I'm fucking over here. I got leaks in my roof. Fucking collecting buckets of water in my living room. Over there looking at him. Fucking using the city water to water his plants. Meanwhile, my garden's fucking dead. All right, so I'm like, all right, Norm, all right, Norm, quit being shy. Go over there, introduce yourself, okay? So I go over there. I'm like, hey, I was like, what is a guy like you? What is a guy like you? What is a guy like you? Good-looking guy like you? What is a guy like you? What is a guy like you doing? A suit and tie. A two-car garage. You got two cars. You got a motorcycle out there. You got a basketball hoop for your kid. I said, what does a guy like you do for a living? I said, what does a guy like you do? He said, he said, I'm a professor of logic down at the University of Science. I said, by God, professor of logic. I was like, I don't consider myself the smartest man. I was like, what's logic? I was like, you're gonna have to give me an example. He said, all right, all right. I said, I'll ask you a few things, and based on that information, I'll be able to tell you a little bit about yourself there. All right. I said, okay, wow, all right, all right, all right. So he says, yeah, you got a dog? I said, by God, I do. He said, all right, awesome. And next question. I said, okay, okay. He said, I can tell right there on that wedding ring on your finger. I can tell that you're a happily married man. I said, oh my God, I am a happily married man. He said, yeah, based on those couple details about those things I asked you, I can infer based on that information that you are a heterosexual man. I said, by God, you're right. So I said, oh my God, I had never been so blown away. So time had passed. The way the wind blows. Seasons had passed. Is there raining? I found myself one day late. Sitting at a bus stop. With a gentleman. It's at 8:45. It's at 9:15. It's at 9:30. It's at 9:45. It's at 10 o'clock. I'm sitting there. Bored with this man, and trying to pass the time. I said, hey. And the guy says, yeah, I said, I'm my neighbor down there, my neighbor down by my house, I got a new neighbor that moved in. He's a professor of logic down at the University of Science. And this guy says, by God, what's logic? And I said, funny you should ask. So I said, I'm going to ask you a couple questions right there. And I said, based on this information, I'll be able to tell you a little bit about yourself. How does that sound? The guy said, I get all this for free. I said, by God, you do. So, all right, I look at the guy and I said, you got a dog? And he says, oh, I don't. I said, oh, you must be one of them gays.